Hi everybody, welcome to Vijayasur Foundation. My name is Manoj Swaminathan and today we are going to learn about causality assessment in pharmacovigilance. Causality assessment is also known as relatedness assessment. That is the relationship between the drug or the medicine and the adverse event, right? So the assessment of this relationship is causality. Now let's look at the definition of causality assessment. It's the method used for determining the causal association or relationship between the drug exposure and the adverse drug reaction, right? It is primarily the relationship, whether a relationship exists or not, whether a medicine might have caused an adverse event or not, right? So if it is related to the medicine, then it becomes an adverse drug reaction. So until there is ambiguity, it is adverse event. Now the question is who performs this activity in a pharmaceutical company? At the moment, it is primarily the medical reviewer. Generally, a physician, a safety physician, or the medical reviewer undertakes this activity. Hopefully in future you would be able to automate this activity and your computers would do this activity on their own, but at the moment it is primarily the physicians. So what are the factors associated with causality? So there are primarily four factors: drug, event, patient, and clinical. So drug related, event related, patient related, and the clinical factors. Okay. Now let us look at each of this in detail. First is drug related. So this is related to the labelness of the medicine, that it is already known to cause, the relatability, then the predisposing factors, and the concomitant medications. So concomitant medications are the medicines which are used along with the suspect drug. Okay. Then let us look at the event related factors. So see, adverse events are generally or most often drug related, and very rarely it may be different. Okay. So let us now look at the third, that is patient. Now, it adverse event may be caused in certain patients while not in some patients, right? So it is primarily genetic also in origin. That is a possibility, right? Something what we call pharmacogenomics, because every patient would respond differently to a medicine. So if there is the same medicine, it may cause an adverse event in one patient but not in the other patient. So right, so it can the adverse event may even be patient related. So what all factors? The medical history of the patient, the predisposing factors, and the past history. It is possible that the patient had an allergic reaction to penicillin when he was small, and if now you start something like a cephalosporin, the patient may develop an allergic reaction with the new medicine, right? So that is also a possibility. Then finally, the clinical, right? So the temporal relationship. So what do you mean by temporal relationship? It is the onset of the adverse event after taking the medicine, right? Now, if somebody takes the medicine and immediately has a reaction, then you know that okay, it may be related to the medicine. But what if the patient takes the medicine and has an adverse event 3 days later? Then there may be a situation where there may be some other factor causing the adverse event, or sometimes if the drug has long shelf life, sorry, half life, then also that is possible. Then de-challenge, re-challenge, right? We already learnt about de-challenge, re-challenge. So what is it? It is about stopping the medicine and what happens to the adverse event, and then restarting the medicine and trying to understand what happens with the adverse event. Then finally the response to the corrective treatment, right? So if there is an adverse event, for example, say an allergic rash, and the patient is given something like a cetirizine or chlorpheniramine for treating the adverse event, and does it get resolved? If it doesn't get resolved, there may be some other reason, right? So these are all the factors associated with causality. Now, when you talk about causality methods, right? So, how do you assess the causality, right? What methods do you use for causality assessment? The most commonly used are the Naranjo algorithm and the WHO UMC causality assessment. There are many more scales available, but then these are the most commonly used. And even among these, the most commonly used is the WHO UMC causality assessment. Okay. Now, what we will do is we will learn about both this in detail. Let us first learn about the Naranjo algorithm, right? So here you can find 10 questions, okay? And for every association, right? So that is a patient taking the medicine and an adverse event happening, you would look at all these questions and you would get the answer, and then if it is yes, then you get a score of +1 or +2. If it is no, then it may be 0, -1, +1 or +2, and if you don't know, then it is 0. Okay, so if what we can do is we can look at this with an example as well. So once you get the total score, then you look at the table on the right. So if it is more than or equal to 9, then the causality is definite, right? So definite probability, then probable, then possible, then doubtful. So if it is 5 to 8 score, then it is probable. 1 to 4, it is possible, and if it is 0, it is doubtful. Right? Doubtful is where it may or may not be related to the medicine. Okay. Now let us look at this with an example. On 1st of June 2021, Raj was started on amoxicillin 500 milligram thrice a day for his throat infection. On the next day, that is 2nd June, he developed itchy rashes over his body. On 3rd June, that is the next day, the dose was reduced to 250 milligram thrice a day, and on the next day, the rash disappeared. As the intensity of infection increased, the dose was again increased to 500 milligram on the next day. But then on 6th of June, he again developed generalized itchy rashes. Right? Generalized itchy rash. So let us now look at this, right, with the Naranjo algorithm. Now here, let us look at each of these questions. Okay, are there previous conclusive reports of this reaction? Amoxicillin is known to cause rashes, right? It's allergic reaction. So it's a penicillin derivative. So answer is yes, right? So +1. Then did the adverse event appear after the suspect drug was administered? Yes, right? Because the patient took the medicine on 1st June and had the adverse event on 2nd of June. So again the score is +2. Now, did the adverse reaction improve when the drug was discontinued? Yes, right? So the dose was reduced to 250 milligram and the rash disappeared, right? So again it is +1. Now, did the adverse event reappear when the drug was re-administered? Right? So the dose was increased to 500 milligram and the patient again developed generalized itchy rashes. So here the score will be +2. Then are there alternate causes other than the drug that could have caused the reaction? Uh, yeah, you may argue that there may be an insect bite, right? But then looking at the de-challenge and re-challenge, it is less likely, right? So you can either give it as +1 or you can give it as 0. Okay. Now, was the drug detected in blood in concentrations known to be toxic? So have we done the blood test? No, right? So it is do not know, or right? It is 0. So the eighth question, was the reaction more severe when the dose was increased or less severe when the dose was decreased? Uh, so the event disappeared. So it was not, it did not reduce in intensity, but then when the drug was re-administered, it increased in intensity. So you can consider what score to give. And finally, did the patient have similar reaction to same or similar drugs in the previous exposure? We don't know, right? The past history of the patient. Was the adverse event confirmed by any objective evidence? Again, here you have minimal information, so you don't know. So that again the score is 0. Now, based on this, you add up all the numbers, and I think it should be more than 9, right? Or 5 to 8. So there'll be some people who would get more than 9, and there'll be some who would get say 6 or 7. So both are right. So it's all about medical judgment, right? So this is the way you undertake the causality assessment using the Naranjo algorithm. Okay. Now let us look at the WHO UMC causality assessment system. Okay. So this was developed by the World Health Organization, and UMC stands for Uppsala Monitoring Center. So they have jointly developed this causality assessment system, and you find certain probable or likely, possible, unlikely, conditional or unclassified, and finally unaccessible or unclassifiable. So these are the various causality scales available in the WHO system. Now, if there is a very strong association, then it is certain, and if you need more information, then it becomes conditional. Or if you are very clear that it is not related, then it becomes unlikely. And finally, that you cannot assess based on the information available, then it becomes unaccessible or unclassifiable, right? So based on the information available, you would be able to determine. Okay. Now, if you look at the previous example, uh, then you might come to the conclusion that it is certain causality, right? Or that maybe some people would say it is probable. So it can vary, and this is the way it works. Okay. So it is finally the strength of association, right? So based on the strength of association, if there is high or greater strength of association, then it is certain, and if it is less, then it becomes probable, or lesser than possible, and so on. Now, the concept of implied causality. Okay. Now, if a patient takes a medicine and has an adverse event, so what would the patient do? Patient would either report it to the physician or else report it to the company. So the patient would put in efforts to reach out to the physician or reach out to the company. Now, the physician may report to the company as well. Now, in such cases, so these are all spontaneous case reports, right? So, or the non-solicited case reports. So here, you find somebody putting efforts and then reporting to the company. So here, the causality is implied, right? If you get any spontaneous case report, even if you are convinced as a company representative that it is not related to the medicine, but still you should consider that a causal relationship exists, right? Considering the efforts which somebody has put. Now, that's something very important, that if you have received any spontaneous case report, you should always consider that some kind of a causal relationship exists. You should not rule out any causal relationship. Why important? Because at times, if you rule out causal association, you may not report the adverse event report. So that's the most important factor which needs to be considered over here. Okay. Now, the terms, right? You know what the difference between an adverse event and adverse drug reaction. Now, when you talk about adverse event, there is no causality or unknown causality because we have not, still not assessed it. And adverse drug reaction, it is a reaction, right? So the causal relationship exists. Similarly, SAE and SUSAR, serious adverse event. Okay, and here it is suspected, unexpected, serious adverse reaction. So when you say reaction, it is related to the medicine, right? So what I'm trying to tell you is, if it is SUSAR, then yes, causal relationship certainly exists, yeah, or causal relationship exists. So that's something you should always remember, that the main difference between AE and ADR is that in ADR, you have already assessed the causality and it exists. So causal relationship exists in an adverse drug reaction. Now, vaccines, right? In case of vaccines, the causality is not done in the same way as for medicines or drugs. So vaccines, it is done slightly differently, and AEFI, right? Adverse event following immunization. So we'll quickly look at this, that how this assessment is done, and again something which has been suggested or recommended by the WHO. In case of an AEFI, the adverse event may be vaccine related, where it can be related to the product itself or the quality of the product. Okay, or it may be related to the vaccination, the entire immunization process, even anxiety before receiving the vaccine, that is also a possibility. And finally, it may be a proper adverse event which is related to the vaccine. Okay, so this is something good to know, that in case of adverse events following immunization, it may be vaccine related or vaccination process related, or it may be an adverse event. Okay, so when I say vaccine related, it is primarily the quality, right? While transporting the vaccine, you did not take care of the temperature requirements, and as a result, the vaccine became turbid, or say some kind of contamination. So this is vaccine related. Okay. Now, how does the WHO recommend, or how this causality assessment needs to be done, right? So there are five principles that underpin the causality assessment. So one is the strength of association between the adverse event or the EFI and the vaccine administration. Then the consistency, like you have been receiving a particular report, and or it is known to cause and so on. Then the specificity of the adverse event, right? Then it can be the temporal relationship, that you gave the vaccine and immediately an adverse event happened, or the next day adverse event happened, rather than something happening after 2 weeks or 3 weeks. Then the biological plausibility, right? So this is the vaccine's nature itself causing an adverse event, right? So vaccines are known to cause anaphylaxis or allergic reactions or injection site pain, injection site reactions. So that is also a possibility. Now let us look at the uh, four-step process for causal association, causality association or assessment. So this is something proposed by the WHO, and very interesting as well. So this is the adverse event following immunization or AEF5 form, and this is for the causality assessment. And you have a series of questions. You need to answer them, and based on that, you will be able to assess the causal relationship. Okay, let us look at this step by step. So the first step is whether this adverse event is eligible to be considered an AEFI, and also to determine the causality. So once you do that, you fill up the checklist, right? You fill up all the information, step by step information. Then once you get all the information, then you can here is a flow chart or an algorithm, that is there a known causal relationship with the vaccine, then yes, then what, and so on, right? So you have this. I wouldn't go deep into it, but then I can what I can do is I can share the link to this, so that you can read it further. Okay. So once you do this, the fourth step, you do the classification, whether it is A, B, or C. A is consistent causal association to immunization. B is indeterminate, that you are not able to understand, and C is inconsistent causal association. It is more likely to be unlikely, right? C may be unlikely, B will be say something which is doubtful, and A is yes, a causal relationship exists. And finally, if it is like you don't have the required information, then it is unclassifiable. So it can be A, B, or C, or it can be unclassifiable. And finally, based on the information and what you have included, you would determine, okay, with the available evidence, we conclude that the classification is dash because, so with the reason. So this is how the WHO EFI causality is done. Now, the scope of automation, right? So, for a company to undertake causality assessment, they need physicians. And at times it may not be convenient and it may be not cost effective for the company. So nowadays companies are evaluating to automate this process, apart from other activities that companies are evaluating to automate. So here, it is typical that if a physician thinks about, okay, this is probable or is it possible, why does he or she think about it, right? So based on this, you undertake a machine learning exercise, and you would require say thousands and or say even millions of cases. Based on that, you understand, and based on that thinking process, the computer also would learn that okay, uh, it's, when I say computer, it is typically the computer language, right? It would learn that okay, if this is the situation, a physician may have assessed it as possible, and if this is the situation, then a physician may have assessed it as probable. So based on this, you train, right, this exercise which is called machine learning. So you train the computer or the software or the system, and based on it, you can automate the entire process, and then you can validate it as well. So you just enter data and you check what causality assessment is automatically selected. So this is going to be the future, right? That most of the companies would evaluate to automate. Okay. So what did we learn today? So we learned about causality assessment. Then we also learned about the scales of assessment, wherein we looked at the Naranjo algorithm as well as the WHO UMC assessment, and we also looked at the WHO EFI causality assessment. Right? Then causality is, it's all about strength of association. Right? So if there is a greater strength, then it is more likely that the adverse event is related to the medicine. Right? So it becomes an adverse reaction. And finally, we also learned about the WHO EFI causality assessment. Right? I will be sharing that link with you, so that you can learn further about this. So I trust you found this session to be useful and important and interesting. Feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions, comments, or even suggestions. Okay. All the best. Take care.